We're going to be replacing the tool in motor sensor on a DL-NC, and the tools required will be a 2.5 millimeter Allen. This is also a 2.5 millimeter Allen, but it has a ball end on it. A 3 millimeter Allen, a 5 millimeter Allen, a flathead screwdriver, and flush cuts for cutting zip ties. Standard Allens will work just fine, but I'm using T-handles and a palm driver for ease of use and for speed. The first thing we need to do is remove the cable from the connector here. So we'll start with the 2.5 millimeter Allen and remove this bolt here. Next, we'll use the 5 millimeter Allen to remove this bolt. Lastly, we'll be removing the cable. There are pins on the inside of this housing, and they are pretty delicate, so it's important to kind of pull straight up and gently to prevent breaking or bending those little tiny pins inside. And that takes care of that. Next thing we'll do is remove the air lines up here. I like to pull the airline out of one of the reducers and leave the reducer in the other one, and that helps me know which port they go back to when I'm reassembling. This can all just get tucked over to the side. We won't need it until we're putting everything back together. Next, we'll use a 2.5 millimeter Allen again to take this cover plate off. It's a bit of a squeeze, but it's doable. This is where the standard L Allen wrenches might be a little more helpful. Then we remove this cover plate where this has to come out. That goes right back in. This can get set aside. And then we will be replacing this sensor right here, labeled 1. Once the cover plate's been removed, we will now be removing this trap plate that holds the sensor in place. So we'll remove this bolt and make sure that we carefully take it out so that the bolt and the piece don't fall into the motor. A magnet might be helpful for this step of the process. Now the sensor just pulls straight out, just like that. Now that the sensor's been removed, we need to remove this air fitting and manifold port with, again, the 3 millimeter Allen. This allows us access to the electrical connection on the sensor itself. So you would cut this shrink wrap back, and underneath is an electrical connection. You would disconnect the old sensor, plug in the new one, and we recommend wrapping it with electrical tape, or if you have heat shrink, that is okay to use as well. And then now we'll start reversing the process with the new sensor in. Tuck that down under there and put the air port back in, the same orientation that it came out in. The new sensor will then be inserted into the old port. And if you'll notice that the sensor is not centered on its brass housing, and when it's installed, we're gonna have to rotate it around with the tool in the collet until we receive the input on the PLC notifying the computer that there is a tool in the motor. So that's the trickiest part of this installation. So we'll put that back in. With the sensor reinstalled in the motor, we will now take the retaining block that was removed and put it back in. Again, being careful not to drop it inside the motor. And at this step, we will not be tightening this completely down because we need to verify that, as I mentioned before, that the sensor is rotated correctly inside the housing to be reading the tool-in motor device inside the motor. So what you would do is, with a tool in the motor, you would just rotate this around with the flathead screwdriver until you receive the input on the PLC I-2021. It goes through a relay, so there will be a light indicator on the relay here, and there will be the light on the PLC here. If you're receiving these lights, then this has been rotated to the correct position. This is a zoomed in, and this is a farther out photograph of the PLC for the head. Again, it's this relay here going to that input block there. When reinstalling the motor cable, it's very important to make sure that the pins on the cable on here are lined up correctly with the pins on the motor. They are very fragile and can bend or break quite easily. So it's important not to force anything and to really make sure that the housing here is meshing correctly with the housing on the motor, and just get it seated, and then replace this small bolt with the 2.5 millimeter Allen through here. Sometimes you have to push down on the cable in order to get it seated properly. And that bolt gets reinstalled. And then this bigger bolt with the 5 millimeter Allen also goes back down here. When reinstalling the airline, we'll put the bigger 3/8 clear airline in the cooling plate fitting. And then, since I left this reducer on this airline, I know that it goes to this port right here. So I'll plug that back in. And this airline without the reducer will go into the reducer on the port on the left-hand side. And that is now complete. Once the sensor here has been adjusted so that the PLC is registering a tool is in the motor, it's very important to come back and tighten this retaining block, which keeps the sensor from rotating. That traps the sensor in place so it doesn't rotate out of position and lose the tool in motor sensor going forward.